The 10th Bell by Elowen Greaves. Read by Wilbur Friesman-Durst. I came to Windlow Hollow under circumstances that at the time struck me as entirely ordinary. The matter concerned an inventory, not of property, but of parish holdings and ecclesiastical records which the diocese, in its tiresome diligence, had commissioned me to review. Such labours were neither foreign nor unpleasant to me. I had made something of a modest reputation for myself in the study of minor church histories, where petty disputes over boundaries, fonts, tithes, and burials provided, if not grand discovery, then at least quiet work for a man of my temperament. Windlow Hollow was not much to look at, a clutch of houses pressed into a dip between wooded ridges, their chimneys bending slightly under years of prevailing wind. The church sat somewhat apart from the village proper, up a narrow track where hedgerows grew too thick and too old to have been planted by any living hand. It was not until my third evening in the village that I first heard the name given to the church by those who lived under its shadow. The 9 Bells, the innkeeper had called it as she set down my supper. I glanced up. I thought its dedication was to St. Pelagius. She nodded, folding her hands against her apron. Oh, aye. In the books it is, but folk here call it the 9 Bells. I smiled politely. For its tower, I presume. An unusually large peal for so small a place. Her smile faltered just slightly. 9, yes, but that's not why. And here she glanced almost reflexively toward the shuttered window, though the hour was not yet late. It's because, she said softly, sometimes you hear the 10th. I set down my fork, the warmth of the stew momentarily forgotten. The 10th? I repeated, more curious than alarmed. You mean a 10th bell once existed, and was lost, perhaps? She shook her head gently. No, sir. There's only ever been the 9. No record, no missing bell in any inventory, not even when the tower was repaired after the lightning strike in 54. But still— Her voice lowered further, as though the very mention of it might summon something uninvited. Still, there are nights when you hear it, not part of the proper tolling, not rung by hand or rope. You'll hear the 9 strike plain enough, and then there comes another, always a little after. Not loud, but clear, like it doesn't quite belong in the air. I found myself oddly reluctant to smile, though the rational part of me was quick to summon explanations. The mind can play such tricks on the ear when listening for patterns. A distant echo, perhaps, or some sympathetic vibration of the tower itself. And does it occur often? I asked. She hesitated. More often lately. I raised an eyebrow. And has anyone investigated? The vicar, perhaps. The vicar's not lived here these last 2 years, she said. They've not yet sent us a proper replacement. There's only old Mr. Dent now, who sees to the services, but he won't go up the tower. Says it isn't his place. At this she made a faint gesture, not quite a cross, but some instinctive warding sign, old and half forgotten. It's best not to speak too much of it, she added. You'll find what you need in the ledgers, sir, but don't go troubling yourself with the bells. I thanked her politely, but of course in that moment my interest was already fixed. For a man trained to sift the truths behind village superstition, such evasions were irresistible. The bells would bear examination, and in the days that followed I began to make my inquiries. The following morning, I walked the short distance up the lane to the church itself. The path narrowed as it climbed, flanked on both sides by yew and elder that leaned inward, their gnarled branches filtering the light into pale green shafts that danced across the ground beneath my feet. The church stood modest and crooked at the crest, its stones weathered to a gentle softness, as though worn by the long weight of watching generations. The tower rose behind it, sturdy, square, and disproportionately tall for so small a house of worship. Its bells were quiet now, their mouths visible through the arched louvres high above. I counted them, 1, 2, 3, and at last 9. As the innkeeper had said, no space remained for a 10th. The tower was full, its structure whole and unbroken. The caretaker met me at the porch, a small man, thin in frame, but with eyes like bright polished stones. He introduced himself simply as Dent. "Mr. Dent," I began, offering him the letter of commission I carried, "I am here on behalf of the diocesan registry. You have been informed, I trust." He nodded, glancing briefly at the papers, but scarcely reading them. "Aye. You'll find the parish records inside, sir, safe as they've ever been." He turned and led me within without further preamble. The interior was dim but orderly. Dust hung in slow beams through the air, disturbed only by our passing. The ledgers, when produced, proved entirely unremarkable. Births, marriages, deaths, tithes paid or overdue. Nothing among them hinted at anything so peculiar as the rumors I had now heard whispered more than once. After several hours' work, Mr. Dent brought me tea, placing the cup gently beside my elbow. He stood silent for a moment before speaking. "You've seen the tower, sir?" he asked quietly. "I have," I replied. 9 bells, as reported, quite well kept." His gaze flicked briefly toward the narrow window, as if confirming the great stone mass still stood beyond it. "Folk speak nonsense about it. You'll have heard?" "I have heard mention of a 10th bell," I said, my tone light. His face twitched almost imperceptibly. "A bell that isn't there, sir, nor ever was." "And yet it is heard." He swallowed once, his throat bobbing beneath the thin skin of his neck. "Some say so. I've not heard it myself, but others have. Always that same pattern, 9 tolls, then a pause, then the 10th. "And how long has this been reported?" I pressed. His eyes narrowed slightly, voice lowering as though to prevent its escape beyond these old walls. "Longer than my years, sir. My grandfather heard it once. My father, never. Myself, never. But the village hears it from time to time." He shifted uncomfortably. "Best not to give it too much attention. It favors those who listen too closely." There was nothing theatrical in his words, no conscious air of superstition, only quiet, weary caution, as though the matter had worn grooves into his very thoughts. I offered him what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "It is my task, Mr. Dent, to attend to the records alone. I shall not trouble the bells." But I knew, even then, that I would. The bells rang for the first time during my stay on the following Sunday. I had taken my usual seat toward the back of the nave, notebook folded shut in my coat pocket. The congregation was small, perhaps 24 souls scattered loosely across the pews, their voices rising thinly in the responses. Mr. Dent led the service in the absence of any appointed vicar, his reading steady but curiously hurried, as though eager not to outlast some private threshold of safety. At the conclusion, the bells began their peal. Their voices were rich, clear, and ordered. Each note fell precisely after the other, filling the small stone chamber with layered resonance. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then silence, a perfect, rightful silence. No 10th. I exhaled, though whether in disappointment or relief I could not say, and yet, late that night, I awoke. It was not a noise that disturbed me at first, but rather a sensation, the kind of stirring that unsettles the nerves before the mind fully wakens. My room at the inn was dark, but for a narrow sliver of moonlight threading between the curtains. The hush was near complete, save for the distant creak of timber and the faint sighing of the wind against the eaves. Then came the sound, soft but unmistakable. 9 tolls, clear as when I had heard them earlier that morning, though far fainter through the thickness of night and distance. I counted each one beneath my breath, my eyes open now to the black ceiling above. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then a pause, not lengthy, not accidental. And after it, a 10th. But unlike the others, it was not so much struck as summoned. Its tone was thinner, more distant, almost metallic, as though sounding from behind a veil of stone or earth. The air itself seemed to draw slightly inward with its arrival, as though the village itself had been waiting for it. The hairs along my arms rose, my breath slowed involuntarily. The sound was not loud, no louder than a clock chime far down a corridor, but it landed within me with a peculiar weight. And then it was gone. The silence that followed was not peaceable. It was a silence that waited for acknowledgment. I lay in the dark for some time before sleep returned, and when it did, it was shallow, brittle, and unsatisfying. The following morning I found myself restive, unable to focus upon my assigned work. The ledgers sat open before me once more, but their dry notations blurred across my sight as my thoughts circled that thin, impossible toll of the 10th bell. I ventured again to the church after the noon meal, half under pretense of examining certain records stored in the vestry. Mr. Dent was not present this time, and I let myself in with the small iron key provided by the diocesan office. The air inside was cooler than without, thick with the faint perfume of old wood and worn stone. Dust motes circled in the still shafts of light that slipped between high-set windows, but it was the tower that drew me. I stood beneath it, craning my head to trace its steep ascent. The bells rested in their nested cradles, silent, glinting faintly where light caught the curves of their bronze mouths. They were arranged as any such peal would be, each diminishing slightly in size toward the highest tiers. 9 bells, only 9. And yet I could not dispel the uneasy sense that there was something more within that tower, not hidden precisely, but folded, as though space itself had misled the eye. There was a narrow stair winding upward within the tower's wall. The stone steps were worn to gentle curves beneath centuries of climbing feet. I ascended carefully, hand trailing along the cool, damp stones of the inner wall. As I climbed, the air grew thinner, drier. The creak of distant timbers accompanied my steps, and now and then a soft rustle. Pigeons roosting somewhere above, or perhaps something else disturbing the old nesting spaces. At length, I reached the belfry itself. The bells loomed close now, their surfaces mottled with the fine green bloom of aged bronze. Heavy ropes descended through holes in the flooring, coiled loosely below. The open arches of the tower allowed in strips of grey daylight, and from this height the village appeared as a scattering of toys amid patchwork fields. I circled the platform, counting once more, placing my hand briefly upon the rim of each bell as though seeking some hidden fault. 9. No space remained for another, no missing cradle, no removed fittings. The 10th had never stood among these, and yet I felt it here, not seen but undeniably present. A hollow in the air, as though a sound had left its shape behind. There was a faint smell, too, not unpleasant, but sharp, like ironstone wetted after drought. It lingered in the belfry, just beneath the known scents of old timber and birds' roosts. As I turned to descend, a sudden draught moved through the tower, cool against my skin, though the air outside was still, and with that draught came a whisper, so soft I could not be certain whether it reached my ears or my mind directly. Soon! The word, if word it was, seemed to dissolve almost the moment it formed. I paused upon the stair, my hand tightening on the stone rail as I listened, heart quickening in that breathless hush. But there was nothing further. The pigeons shifted uneasily in their niches above. The ropes hung still. Only the faint sound of the wind threading through the tower's upper arches remained. I descended carefully, each step now heavy with an awareness I could not wholly shake off. The sturdy rationality that had guided my life thus far, the comfortable assurance of material explanation, had begun to wear thin. By the time I stepped back into the nave, dusk had begun to gather in the corners of the church. The light fell low through the windows, striping the floor in narrow amber beams. I hesitated before leaving, casting one last glance upward toward the dark mouth of the tower that loomed above. As I emerged into the churchyard, Mr. Dent was standing near the lych gate, waiting with a look that was not entirely surprised to see me. "You've been up, then?" he said. It was not a question. "I have." His face was grave, and for the first time since my arrival, I sensed something beneath his quiet reserve. Weariness, perhaps, or the burden of knowing more than he dared speak. "And did you hear it?" he asked softly. "Not in the tower," I admitted, "but last night in my room." He gave a slow nod, as if this merely confirmed some ledger of private expectations. "It doesn't favor everyone," he said. "Only some. Not always the same ones." "And what is it, Mr. Dent?" I pressed. "Is there truly nothing in the records? No cause? No lost bell?" He glanced away, eyes settling on the stones of the path as though the answers might be written there. "There's no 10th bell, sir, not of this church, but there were bells here before the church stood, before any of this was consecrated ground." I frowned. "Before—" He shifted his weight, voice growing more distant. "They say the hollow was used long before the monks laid stone here, before Windlow Hollow had a name at all. The bells were part of something older, something that called. When the church was raised, the old bells were broken, buried, sealed beneath the new tower's foundation. But you cannot always bury the sound of a thing." He looked up at me then, his eyes dark beneath the fading light. "It was never meant to ring alone. It waits, sir. For what? I do not know." The hairs at my neck rose once more. Mr. Dent offered no further explanation. With a shallow bow, he turned and walked slowly back toward the village, leaving me alone beneath the darkening tower, where the invisible weight of the unstruck bell still pressed faintly against the air. That night I scarcely slept at all. The 10th bell had rung again, precisely as before, 9 full strokes, then the deliberate pause, and that thin, distant chime following after. But this time it did not end. In the hours that followed, as I lay motionless beneath my thin blanket, the sound persisted, not as full tolls, but as an irregular, quiet sequence, like muted notes struck lightly upon glass or bone. The rhythm was uneven, sometimes pausing altogether for long stretches before resuming with a faint insistence. It was not ringing for time, it was speaking. At times I fancied I could almost detect a pattern in the chiming, a cadence suggestive of speech, though the mind recoiled at the notion. No tongue, I knew, moved with such alien intervals, and yet it held the unmistakable weight of intention. Toward the grey of dawn, when exhaustion overcame my watchfulness, my dreams filled with images of the tower. But it was not as it stood now. Rather, it appeared half sunken into the earth, its foundation exposed like the roots of a great dead tree. Beneath it, shapes turned slowly in chambers of stone, bell shapes but distorted, twisted at odd angles as though struggling upward through layers of time. And always, that faint sound pulsed through the air, not striking but breathing. When I woke, my body ached with a leaden fatigue, though my mind burned with fresh urgency. I could no longer remain passive, nibbling at the edges of this mystery. The church itself would offer no more. The tower had revealed all it would to my waking senses, but if Mr. Dent spoke truly, if there were remains beneath the tower's foundation, then the truth lay deeper still. Later that morning I sought out the mason who kept repair of the village's few crumbling walls. A stooped man named Hadlow, who lived in a cottage near the far end of the hollow. His speech was slow and rough, his hands thick with old lime burns and calluses. But when I broached the matter of the tower's undercroft, his face changed. "There's naught below it," he said at first with a certain practised dismissal. "Solid footing. Always was." "But the foundation stones," I pressed, "were they not laid upon earlier structures? Some older chamber, perhaps?" Hadlow shifted his weight uneasily, his eyes narrowing beneath his brow. "Old workmen said there was summit there years back. When the lightning cracked the east wall, they opened part of the footing, found voids beneath, but not full chambers, settled earth, rubble, as though something had been broken and filled in long ago." "And nothing remains of the older bells?" At this he shook his head, but too quickly. "No bells. Just odd shapes in the rock, left untouched, like the vicar then ordered." He glanced toward the church, his voice lowering. "Best not go digging where old things lie quiet, sir. The 9 were hung to drown what was left. Let 'em do their work." The phrase struck me oddly. "To drown what was left," I echoed. Hadlow's eyes fixed on mine then, hard and steady. "It isn't always the living who call bells, sir." And with that, he ended the conversation. For the remainder of that day I wandered the village with no clear aim, my mind circling the words both Mr. Dent and Hadlow had offered, neither willing to say too much, neither able to say less. As evening approached, I found myself once again drawn to the churchyard, as though the tower itself exerted some quiet pull, indifferent but insistent. The sun had dipped low by the time I reached the lich gate. Shadows stretched long across the graves, their crooked stones leaning like tired sentries against the creeping dusk. The tower rose dark above them, its windows black and blind. The bells within now silent once more. I walked slowly, deliberately, allowing my steps to carry me to the base of the tower, where old foundation stones met uneven earth. The smell was stronger here, that faint metallic tang I had first caught in the belfry, now sharper, as though drawn upward by the cooling air. I crouched, running my fingers along a fissure in the stone footing. The crack was narrow but deep, and from it issued the faintest draught, like breath exhaled from lungs buried far below. It was not my imagination. The ground beneath the tower was not wholly still. A faint vibration trembled beneath my fingers, gentle, almost rhythmic, like the pulse of something not yet fully wakened. I do not know how long I knelt there before the first bell sounded. The stroke came sharp and sudden, ringing through the air with clean authority. My breath caught involuntarily. 1. The second followed, then the third, each falling into place with that familiar measured cadence. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The pause that followed was longer than before, deliberate, pregnant as though the tower itself held breath alongside me. And then it came. The 10th. It struck not from above but from beneath, duller than the others but resonant, as though sounding up through layers of stone and soil, muffled by a weight, but not defeated by it. The very ground beneath my knees seemed to flex in answer, the pulse beneath my palm quickening for a moment with the chime's release. This time the toll did not end. A second strike came, soft, uncertain. Then another. The sequence irregular now, staggering like footsteps learning their own rhythm. The air thickened perceptibly, pressing faintly against my skin. The stones about me seemed subtly out of alignment, as though space itself wavered under strain. I rose unsteadily, my breath coming fast. The air hummed, not with sound alone, but with something like presence. I could feel it in my teeth, my fingertips, the base of my skull. The 10th bell had found its voice, and it was no longer content to toll alone. I staggered back from the foundation, the tremor beneath my feet now faint but constant, like some great slow breath drawn from impossible depths. The irregular tolling continued beneath the ground, a language I couldn't decipher, but felt unmistakably as addressed. The village itself had fallen utterly silent. No wind moved the hedgerows, no dogs barked, no doors creaked. The hollow seemed to hold its own breath, as though fearing to intrude upon what now stirred. Above me the tower stood unchanged, 9 silent bells hanging obedient in their cradles, their polished mouths reflecting the last thin sliver of daylight. And yet I felt sure that whatever rang below was not separate from them. The 9 were not defenses. They were accomplices. A strange thought pressed into my mind unbidden. They do not ring against the 10th. They ring to contain it, as though for centuries the rhythm of 9 had not silenced the deeper toll, but rather kept it bound, kept it from completing its full sequence. I do not know whether this was knowledge placed within me, or the wild speculation of a mind fraying at its edges, but I believed it. Another strike echoed from beneath, louder now, less muffled. The vibration in the stones beneath my boots deepened, no longer subtle but insistent, the ground listening as much as it spoke. I looked up then, instinct drawing my gaze. In the belfry above, movement. Not pigeons. A slow, steady turn of shadow, as though something within the tower itself, something unshaped by ordinary form, had begun to stir in sympathetic rhythm to the sounding beneath. The bells above rocked gently, not from wind or human hand, but from the pulse rising through the very bones of the tower. Their ropes quivered, swaying like thin limbs against the dusk. My breath shortened. I was no longer alone. The boundary between the upper bells and the buried toll had begun to dissolve. They were answering each other now, calling across their shared broken ritual. I backed away, stumbling through the crooked headstones, my boots striking stone and soil alike as I fled the churchyard's reach. My heart hammered against my ribs, not merely from fear, but from the weight of something vast unfolding behind me, something neither ancient nor new, but somehow unpaused. And still behind me, through the gathering dark, the 10th bell rang on. The tolling pursued me in my flight, not louder but closer, as though the sound pressed into the very air around me rather than issuing from a single point. My mind struggled to separate direction from vibration. There was no longer a bell tower. There was only the bell. By the time I reached the narrow lane that twisted back toward the village proper, I slowed, not from exhaustion, but from the terrible certainty that distance offered no protection. The hollow itself had grown wrong. The village roofs leaned at unfamiliar angles, shadows pooled where none should have fallen. The moon, pale and thin, rode high above, but its light was insufficient, as though dimmed by some film between it and the world below. I stumbled into the square, half expecting to find others roused, drawn by the unnatural ringing. But the village remained still. Not a lamp burned in any window, no door cracked open. It was as though the entire population had withdrawn into the very stones of their houses, leaving the shell of the village abandoned to the tolling's will. I do not recall making the choice to return to the inn. My feet carried me there of their own accord, as though guided by the simple knowledge that there remained no other sanctuary. The door stood slightly ajar. Within, the innkeeper sat at the small table near the hearth. She did not rise at my entrance nor speak, but her wide, dark eyes fixed upon me with a terrible understanding. "You heard it again," she whispered. It was not a question. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. It rings still." She nodded, folding her hands tightly upon her lap, her knuckles pale beneath her grip. "It's nearly reached the full pattern," she said softly. "It tries every few generations. Not often, but enough." I stared at her, struggling against the pounding in my head. "The full pattern? The 10 were always meant to ring together." Her voice trembled slightly, but her words came steady. "Long before the church stood, before even the monks came, when they raised the tower, they thought 9 would hold it back, a holy number to seal the broken one beneath." Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as though the bell tower loomed above us even here. "But it finds ways to test the pattern every few decades, when someone listens too long, when someone notices. It needs ears, you see." A faint sob shuddered at the edge of her voice, but she mastered it. "That's why we don't speak of it, why Dent won't climb the tower, why Hadlow won't dig." Outside another toll sounded, low, rich, nearer than it had any right to be. The walls of the inn seemed to breathe with its passage, as though the building itself had become part of its instrument. "It was waiting for you," she whispered, "as it's waited before." I staggered backward a pace, the air thickening once more, my skin prickled, my pulse hammering beneath it. "But what happens when it completes?" I gasped. Her eyes met mine. In them I saw not terror, but a resignation deeper than fear. "No one knows," she said. "It never has." The bell tolled again. I do not remember collapsing into the chair, but I found myself there, sitting across from her as the sound pulsed through the very timbers of the room. It was as though the world outside had narrowed to this single space, these 4 walls afloat in a sea of vibration. The bell struck again, but not in rhythm now. The chimes stumbled over one another as if some hand beneath the ground was growing impatient with the old restraint, striking with uneven force, demanding completion. The innkeeper's voice dropped to little more than breath. "It comes closer each time someone listens. The 9th bell holds it, but not forever. When the pattern completes—" She faltered, unable to speak further. I could feel it too now. Not just the sound, but the pull. It was not a call heard with the ears, but felt within bone and blood, as though the marrow itself resonated with the old, unfinished cycle. The air grew warmer, denser. My breath slowed unbidden, matching the swells of unseen movement outside. It was not terror that gripped me now, but something worse. The strange relief of surrender, a yielding that seemed natural, as though this was not invasion but restoration. The 10th bell struck again, then again, faster. The sound no longer echoed but layered, like being submerged beneath peals that were not distinct strokes but continuous waves of vibration. My chest tightened as though my ribs were themselves becoming the clapper of some great hollow bell. The innkeeper's voice reached me once more, faint but urgent. "Don't follow it!" I turned toward her, my lips numb. I'm not moving." But even as I spoke, I realized that I was. My body had risen from the chair as if guided by unseen strings, my legs carrying me toward the door, my fingers reaching for the latch, my skin prickling with the electric hum now running through every surface of the inn. The bells surged, all 10 now ringing together in a harmony that was not human, a sound ancient, mechanical, alive. Through the warped glass of the window I saw the tower bathed in strange light. Not moonlight nor lantern, but something that seemed to seep from within the stone itself, pulsing amber like old honey unearthed after centuries. Behind the glow, I thought I glimpsed movement, forms shifting in rhythm with the bells, though no human could have stood upright within that narrow tower. The innkeeper's voice broke once more through the rising cacophony, the last clear thing I remember hearing. "It only needs you once." And then, the final strike. The 10th bell rang one last time, clear and sharp, neither distant nor near, but everywhere. The sound split something open, not in the air, but in the fabric of the moment itself. The walls of the inn flexed outward and inward, like breath caught mid-draw, and then silence. Complete, absolute, unnatural silence. The 10th bell's final toll cracked through the air, not fading, but hanging there unnaturally long, as though refusing to dissipate into ordinary space. The sound felt layered, not like one bell, but many stacked imperfectly atop one another, creating dissonant waves that shimmered across the surfaces of the village. The pressure in the room receded, but not gently. The weight that had held my chest taut, that had pulled my limbs toward the door, released all at once as though a taut cord had been cut. My knees buckled and I stumbled forward into the table, clutching at its edge to steady myself. The innkeeper let out a breath, a low, shuddering gasp, as though surfacing from some depth. The glow beyond the window was gone. The tower now loomed as it always had, dark, silent, its 9 bells unmoved in their cradles. The 10th, wherever it resided, had gone still again. But something had shifted. I could feel it not as a presence, but as an absence where something should have remained, as though a door had opened and then slammed shut, violently, permanently, but not without letting something pass. The innkeeper remained seated, her face pale but composed. She did not speak. Neither did I. There was nothing useful left to say. The air returned slowly to its familiar damp weight. No further chimes sounded that night, nor the next. I completed my work over the following days in something like a trance, mechanically copying the records I had originally come to examine. The parish ledgers held no reference to what had transpired. No entry waited to be discovered, no old note to explain the tolling beneath. When my commission ended, I departed Windlow Hollow without ceremony. No one saw me off. I have not returned since, and yet even now, as I write this from the safety of distance, I find my thoughts drawn unbidden to that final toll. Not because it persists, not because I still hear it, but because I do not. And because the ground beneath Windlow Hollow remains undisturbed, though I know, somewhere far below the tower, the broken bells are still there. And the pattern now closer to complete. There will be another who advances the pattern further in a year or 10. It matters not. Nor does it matter if the pattern needs one more listener who hears the right way, or if it needs 3, they will come. One by one, the old broken bells will escape into the world, our world, and eventually when the 9 bells, not the ones in the tower, the broken bells down in the earth, all toll free, they will form a vanguard. And wait, they will await the final listener who adds the last coda to the pattern, and the 10th bell will enter the world.